Israel's position is 15th when it comes to the world military power scale. Now, this ranking doesn't just rely on the total number of weapons that are available to Israel, but it rather focuses on the type of weapons, as well as based on military might, international influence, and international alliance. The Israeli Defense Force was founded in 1948, and there's 3 service branches: the Israeli Army, the Israeli Air Force, and the Israeli Navy. From the earlier part of the 20th century, Israel has committed the best of its people to its armed forces. They have created very fantastic soldiers, sailors, and pilots, and the IDF, or the Israeli Defense Force, are one of the best defense forces in the entire world. Through a vigorous recruitment process and training and retention process, they have been able to build one of the most competent and capable defense forces in the world. But did you know that in Israel, both men and women have to be part of the military? In fact, Israel is the only country in the world that maintains obligatory military service for women. Although men need to serve for longer, 32 months compared to women who serve for 24 months. And these men and women who make up the IDF are some of the most highly trained in the world. Since it was founded in 1948, the IDF helped Israel win the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And that war in Israel was known as the War of Independence. Israel also has one of the highest recruitment rates in the world. About 80% of the people who they summon actually end up serving. Now, here's some statistics to break down what their military looks like. Well, first, Israel's population is just over 8 million people. And out of that, their available manpower is 3.6 million people. And their total military personnel sits at 718,250. And Israel's active personnel sits at 168,250. And in their reserve, they have 550,000 reserve personnel. Now, while the size of the Israeli Defense Force's active frontline personnel is pretty small, especially when you compare it to other regions surrounding Israel, such as Egypt, which is at 468,500 active frontline personnel. Turkey at over 400,000, as well as Iran at over 545,000. Israel is actually praised for being able to quickly mobilize their personnel in a very short period of time. Now, moving on to their air power, their total aircrafts are 652. They have a total of 143 helicopters, and transport aircrafts are 101. In terms of their army strength now, Israel has 2,620 combat tanks. Their armored fighting vehicles, it's at 10,185. They got 48 rocket projectors, as well as 300 towed artillery. And then when we examine the Navy of Israel, their total naval assets is at 65. They have 3 corvettes and 6 submarines. And their defense budget is $15.5 billion US. So with a total population of over 8 million people, Israel devotes a considerable portion of their GDP towards their defense budget. And that percentage was at 5.38% in the year 2017. Israel also spends far more on its defense budget than any other Middle Eastern country, even more than Iran and Turkey, who are military powerhouses. However, more money spent on the defense means less for other needs in the country like education, health, and infrastructures. And in recent years, Israel's defense spending has been growing and increasing by about 4 billion Israeli shekels a year, which is about 1.16 billion US dollars. Now, Israel has been locked in conflict with neighboring Palestine for years. It's like this dispute will never ever end. And the big question is, who owns the capital of Jerusalem, Israel or Palestine? Well, US President Donald Trump boasted before his election that he could actually help broker a peace deal between the nations of Israel and Palestine. But recently, Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, reversing a lot of decades of US policy, but even though both Israel and Palestine claim it as their capital. However, the United Nations did reject this, so yeah, Jerusalem is still up for grabs. But despite this ongoing conflict, Israel's defense force is not gonna go down easily. Israel is not your average country. You cannot deny the significant role that this nation has played in the world. Size-wise, however, Israel is pretty small. So how does such a small country like Israel have such enormous power? Israel is in 17th position on the scale of top military powers of the world. This ranking does not only rely on the total number of weapons which are available to one nation, but rather focuses on weapon diversity within the total numbers of weapons available, and is based on three things: military might, international influence, and international alliances. The Israeli Defense Force, as they're called, or simply IDF, was founded in 1948, and it's the only military wing of the Israeli security forces. The service branches are the Israeli Army, the Israeli Air Force, and the Israeli Navy. Now, the IDF is headed by its Chief of General Staff, who's known as the Ramatkal, and he's subordinate to the Defense Minister of Israel, Lieutenant General. For the early half of the 20th century, Israel has committed the best of its people to the armed forces. They have created fantastic soldiers, sailors, and pilots, and the Israeli Defense Forces are one of the most intense defense forces in the world. Through rigorous recruitment, training, and retention process, they have been able to build one of the most competent and capable defense forces in the world. But did you know that in Israel, both men and women must do military service? In fact, Israel is the only country in the world that maintains obligatory military service for women. Although men need to serve for longer, about 32 months, compared to women who serve 24 months, these men and women who make up the IDF are some of the most highly trained in the world. Now, as I mentioned, the IDF was founded in 1948, in the month of May to be exact, by Israel's then Defense Minister David Ben-Gurion, and the IDF helped Israel win the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known there as the War of Independence. Israel also had one of the highest recruitment rates in the world. Some 80% of those who received summons served in the military. Now let's take a look at some of the technical statistics of Israel's defense force. Their available manpower is 3.6 million. Now their total military personnel sits at 615,000. They have 170,000 active personnel and 445,000 reserve personnel. Now, while the size of the standing army of the IDF is small when you compare it to other nations like Egypt and Turkey, Saudi Arabia, even Iran, the IDF is praised for its ability to quickly mobilize its reserve personnel on short notice. Now it's time to look at their air power. So how do these stats look? Their total aircraft sit at 595. They have 253 fighters. They have 146 total helicopters, 18 transport aircrafts as well. When it comes to the land strength of their army specifically, they have 2,760 combat tanks, 6,541 armored fighting vehicles. They have 650 self-propelled artillery. They also got 150 rocket projectors, and their towed artillery sit at 300. Now let's take a quick look at the Navy, see how the stats look for it. They have 65 total naval assets. They got 3 corvettes and 6 submarines. And for the final fact, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institution, Israel's defense budget in 2018 was $15.9 billion US. Now some sources say that number rose to $19.6 billion in 2019. Now with a total population of 8.5 million people, Israel devotes a considerable portion of their GDP towards their defense budget. Again, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, that percentage was at 4.3% of its GDP in the year 2018. Israel also spends far more on defense than any other Middle Eastern country, even more than Turkey and Iran. However, more money for defense means less for other needs of the nation, such as healthcare, as well as its general infrastructure. In recent years, though, Israel's defense spending has been growing, and it's increasing about 4 billion Israeli shekels every single year, which works out to be about $1.16 billion US. Countries that are in support of Israel, starting the country at number 10, and that country is India. And this may come as a surprise to many of you because India sort of tends to straddle the fence between support for Israel and support for Palestine. Either way though, India recognized Israel in the 1950s, but they didn't form any bilateral ties with Israel until the 1990s, early 1990s, and after the liberalization of India, the diplomatic ties really began to be established. India became the biggest importer for arms from Israel, but to maintain the diplomacy, whenever an Indian delegate, for example, used to visit Israel, he would visit Palestine during the same visit. However, India's current Prime Minister Narendra Modi, when he visited Israel in 2017, he was actually the first ever Indian Prime Minister to visit Israel, but didn't visit Palestine on the same trip. The country at number 9 is Greece. Several reports are actually calling Greece Israel's unlikely friend. Although Greece was once anti-Israel, Israel and Greece recently signed a defense deal worth around 1.2 billion pounds. Greece and Israel today enjoy excellent diplomatic relationships, and they actually consider each other allies. Both countries are partners in the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the OSCE for short, and they're also members of the Union for the Mediterranean, the World Trade Organization, and other organizations. Next up, we have Denmark. Denmark voted for the partition of Palestine in the year 1947 and supports Israel in the United Nations. Denmark has an embassy in Israel, and Israel has an embassy in Copenhagen, Denmark, which is the capital. And this has been established since the year 1949. Denmark recognized and established diplomatic relations with Israel on February 2nd, 1949. Germany is also another country that supports Israel. The German government spokesman Stefan Seibert, he said this in a recent statement. This violence cannot be justified by anything. Israel has the right to defend itself against these attacks within the framework of self-defense. So yes, Israel and Germany are allies. However, some say that this relationship is really one-sided because Germany has given Israel reparation money because of certain events in the past, also many powerful military equipment like the Dolphin II submarines. But what does Israel give Germany? Nothing really. Italy comes in at number 6. Italy recognized Israel on February 8th, 1949, and Italy also has an embassy in Tel Aviv, as well as 2 consulate generals in West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, and 4 honorary consulates in Beersheba, Eilat, Haifa, and also Nazareth. And Israel has an embassy in Rome, Italy. Matteo Salvini, who is the head of Italy's Northern League Party and the country's former deputy prime minister, he made headlines recently after he expressed support for Israel on Twitter. This went viral, and this was despite him and his family being threatened because of their stance. Now, continuing this episode with number 5, we have the country of China. China did not establish normal diplomatic relations with Israel until the year 1992. And since then, Israel and China have developed increasingly close relationships when it comes to the economy, military, as well as technology. As a matter of fact, China has become Israel's 3rd largest trading partner globally and the largest trading partner in East Asia. The next country at number 4 doesn't come as a surprise. We have the country of Canada. Since its founding in the year 1948, Canada has supported Israel and its right to live in peace and security with its neighboring countries. Canadian support of Israel includes arms sales, as well as a free trade agreement, security forces collaboration, diplomatic visits, and other forms of diplomatic and economic relations. Canada is also in favor of a 2-state solution, and it was said on May 12, 2021 by Marc Garneau, who is Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Canada is committed to the goal of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East, including the creation of a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel. Canada reiterates its call for the immediate de-escalation of tensions and an end to the violence. Moving on to number 3, we have Australia. Israel and Australia have had diplomatic relations since the Australian government recognized Israel on January 28, 1949. And then almost 20 years after that, the Liberal Country Party coalition supported Israel during and after the 1967 Six-Day War. The Australian government is considering strengthening its trade relations with Israel in hopes that such a deal would boost defense, cybersecurity, as well as innovation. And if you take a look, trade between the countries is already worth about $1.3 billion, with Australian exports to Israel worth about $345 million and imports worth about $1.02 billion. France comes in next at number 2. France is one of the first countries to recognize the new state of Israel and establish diplomatic relations as early as 1949, so right from the very beginning. For decades now, France has been advocating Israel's rights to existence and also live in peace and security, and it also continues to advocate for its full membership in the community of sovereign nations. French President Emmanuel Macron, he affirmed his, quote, unwavering attachment to Israel's security. And President Macron's administration has recently been facing a lot of criticism for its stance that appears to be very anti-Palestine. So they're facing a lot of criticism for their refusal or apparent refusal to condemn anything Israel is doing. And of course, at number 1, we have the country of the United States of America. And this goes back to the very beginning. The former US President Harry Truman was the first world leader to recognize Israel when it was created in the year 1948. So yeah, the United States led the pack in the recognition of Israel. The United States provided Israel $3.8 billion in military aid recently, and Israel also benefits from around $8 billion in American loan guarantees. Both countries, you would say, have common enemies, and the United States gives Israel their military technology and trade, as well as intelligence exchange between the CIA in the United States and Mossad in Israel. The current US President Joe Biden spoke recently with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he said the following words: "My expectation and hope is that this will be closing down sooner than later. Israel has a right to defend itself when you have thousands of rockets flying into your territory." So of course, based on those statements, we see that the United States continuously and will continue, it seems, to support Israel.